Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson. I'm here with Jafar Falahi, a recently Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker. Our other regular guest, Daniel Sanderson, founder of Planksip, is not here today. He is traveling to Greece to fulfill a lifelong dream of visiting Athens, the scene of Plato's dialogues. Daniel views the world through the lens of the Platonic dialogues and looks to Greece as a source of goodness and brings that perspective to this show. Jafar, any update on the nomination?
Um, I think it's Thursday. We'll know. So yeah,
When do you fly to New York?
I would fly tomorrow. Yeah. So we'll find out Thursday,
Cool.
and I'll find out if I get a
We'll know next. We'll know
new
next week.
decoration for my abode. Then.
Amazing. Well, we're very honored to have you here and continue the topic that we've been covering now for a number of weeks. We've actually reached a kind of turning point, conclusion point, having spent time looking at the foundations of uh, the Western approach to what ended up being human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the United States, the Declaration of Independence held certain unalienable rights. We talked about an article in which these rights apply to everyone and are not coercive. And we've explored a little bit about religion in contrast to that. And we ended up looking at Matthew 25, the parable of when the Son of Man returns to sit on his throne of glory and judge the nations. And we arrived at the conclusion, at least I did, that this really points us to the Declaration of Human Rights because Jesus himself said that by whatever judgment you mete out, that's how you're going to be judged. So separating the nations related to whether or not they were giving water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, clothing the naked, and treating those in prison with dignity, visiting them, looking perhaps to help them versus to punish them, even though prison and punishment may well be necessary. The goal, the purpose of it would be to rehabilitate, to help, not simply to punish, visiting those in prison. Anyway, the human rights articles really focus around these four things. There are some other things, but you could say that's the heart and core of it. So I arrived at the conclusion that this is how the nations will be separated. This is how they will be judged, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it encapsulates those things that Jesus was talking about. So, having explored that and looked at some of the individual articles that are part of that Declaration of Human Rights, we decided we were going to pivot a little bit away from digging into that. And I'm going to ask now a more basic question, right? So, if it's true that we as a species have now arrived at this point in time, having established this standard, you might say it's the golden rule. And we go back to Jeremiah, I believe it is, where it says that he will magnify the law and make it honorable. And in that sense, it is honorable in that all the nations have signed up, all the nations have agreed to it as a law, as a universal standard. It has been magnified and made honorable and made applicable to the entire world. Having accomplished that to that degree, is religion still necessary? If religion brought us to this point, and this is the goal of the Son of Man judging the nations and separating them like sheep and goats, and having established such a standard that can do that, is religion still necessary? We had a brief discussion about this beforehand. Jafar, what are your thoughts about it?
Um, well, I think that life is about more than just. Well, obviously, obviously it is because um, there's lots of nations that aren't that are not obeying, that aren't signed on or aren't obeying those human rights rules, right? So it's not just having that there, having a code of law there, is nice, but if nobody follows it and none of it is enforced, then what's the point, right? It just makes us all hypocrites, which is sort of what you're saying, right? So it's nice to know if you're a hypocrite, like that's the first step, but like how do you go from that state to actually doing the right thing, or wanting to do the right thing for that matter? So I think that in that sense, or even having a language to talk about what it is that would be right, like it's not like, I felt like someone was saying recently that, I guess it wasn't on our last call, but like there's a lot, like there's 30 articles there, but once you get down to the nitty gritty on how to enforce them when they do in fact need to be enforced, it's not so black and white about, there's a ton of nuance. And then how do you find those answers, right? It takes a lot of will and energy and effort and desire to suss all that out, and a lot of goodwill, and a lot of, say, fear of doing the wrong thing, right? Which fear of, like, the purpose you were saying earlier is the fear of, we don't want to coerce people, right? We want to treat people as if they were Christ, right? So how do we do that unless we actually think that we fear harming them as if we fear harming Christ or God? So I think you still do need religion. Otherwise, they're just a bunch of laws, and it's just a matter of time before clever humans figure out their ways around them. Which is what
Well,
we're best at.
one of the thoughts that comes to my mind as we discuss this is that I always looked at Matthew 25 from a personal perspective. I even gave a sermon on it, as I've mentioned. I don't know, 18 years ago now in Estonia, on this passage, and asked the question: how do we, speaking to the assembled people in the congregation that I was speaking to over there, how do we ensure that we are sheep, not goats? And I was applying it personally, right? So what's fascinating to me is this realization that Jesus was not applying it personally. Obviously, we can and should and must apply it personally, but this isn't an article of salvation, right? The separation was applied to the nations as a whole. So what's fascinating is when we look at it in aggregate, it's very different. An individual can certainly choose to behave in a certain way, but the nations are struggling with delivering these human rights on aggregate. We have all kinds of different nations trying all kinds of different systems, and none of them work very well right now, right? There have been points of light over history in America, in fact, being a major source of light, that shining city on the hill, America being an inspiration to many nations across the planet for decades. But today, America has a tarnished image, and there are many, many who are seeking to further undermine, that image, that claim to exceptionalism. They're focused on America's original sin or sins, and really dethroning America as a model and as an inspiration. And yet, all the nations are trying to deliver these things, and they're all struggling with doing so on aggregate. And one of the reasons for that is your point: coercion does not work. The the program and ideology that was proposed at the turn of the 20th century, which caught on like wildfire across the world, was communism, with its claim of delivering these things, right? The workers' paradise. I remember my cousin Peter over in Sweden used to tell this joke. I doubt he's listening tonight, but he used to tell this joke that these submarines and ships that were patrolling the Baltic over there between Sweden, Finland, and Russia were making sure that the citizens of these Scandinavian countries did not escape into the workers' paradise, right? That they were, the citizens of Scandinavia were so eager to go join the workers' paradise that the Soviet Union had to man the Baltic Sea with ships to protect them from crashing the border and fleeing into the country the way in America, you know, there's a flood of immigration seeking to gain entry into America, as tarnished as its image is, as much as those would like to portray it, as a somehow an evil cancer. Yet many nations are still citizens of many nations are still trying to get into America. My point being, communism in particular laid claim, even I'm a huge massive fan of the Beatles. John Lennon's song Imagine, right? Imagine no possessions, it's easy if you try, right? Proclaiming that fantasy that communism holds out the answers. Yet the experiment with communism across many nations has shown that it doesn't deliver these human rights. And so the nations are struggling to deliver these human rights. And coercion doesn't end well. Trying to force people to live to this standard that the leaders of a nation believe will deliver these things does not work. Whether it be communism, whether it be fascism, we have that. History is littered with experiments of trying to create a better society to deliver these things. So, is religion necessary? Well, coercion is not the answer. Inspiration is the answer. And religion provides inspiration to have people who want to achieve these standards, people who are willing to lay down their lives in sacrifice, literally and figuratively, to pursue the goals and the ends, whether it's Albert Schweitzer building hospitals in Africa, or Mother Teresa in India, or many other examples that come from religion. Not, by the way, we're Daniel here, not to dismiss the many who have done so without a religious motive. And yet religion has been the source of inspiration to millions of people to build some of the more successful experiments on
Well,
how to deliver these things.
I mean, I'm obviously after World War II, they decided they needed to do something, and they appointed Eleanor Roosevelt as the person who was going to head drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and so they picked people from all over the world, and it was there were Christians involved, and there were different lawyers involved, and I don't know their names, but there was one Eastern philosopher involved, and there was all these different voices that got together, and they weighed in on how to word this thing, and I think they took out the word he in some they collaborated on it. Point being, and there was all these different religions collaborating on it, but they were and even Eleanor Roosevelt, they were all inspired to do so because of what they had just witnessed, and they were looking for something higher. They were looking for a higher standard. They were looking for some North Star to aim at, and I think that from what I remember, there were religions involved, but they worked together to aim at that. And I don't know what most people who are religious or not think of like the role of I mean, I guess that's a question I have for you. Like, so you started saying that the nations are the ones being judged, but like a nation is an amalgamation. Well, it's not. It's different from. It's not just like there is no true democracy, right? Generally speaking, you have a sort of cross between a oligarchy and an aristocracy and a democracy and a in some states a kingship. So there is a detachment between the average person and the ruling class, right? So in that sense, are you saying that the ruling class is being judged kind of separately from the people, or do you think the Bible sees them as one and the same, like, are kings separate from?
Interestingly, I lived briefly in Switzerland, Spent a much longer period of time in Germany serving in Switzerland. In fact, I'm drinking from a beer mug here, but friends, it's tea. I do not drink alcohol, but this beer mug, this Bierstein, is from Basel, Switzerland, and it's one of the souvenirs. Back when I was living there, I was on a strict budget, and the investing in that Bierstein um, was a big thing, and so I still enjoy drinking my tea out of it. Point being that Switzerland is one of the closest nations to a true democracy, and I learned a lot about that while I was there with its cantons and actually having four official languages in Switzerland. Um, but to your point, yes, are no, right. They're not true democracies. However, and this is my opinion in full disclosure as a Baha'i, that the process has been underway for some time of Matthew 25 being fulfilled. And the kings were already judged. I won't get into the specifics. The Baha'is know and understand what I'm talking about. The kings were already judged based on their response to the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. Let's just say 1844, the end of the times of the Gentiles. The kings that were in many cases coronated in the name of Jesus, right? Jesus, there are prophecies about Jesus and every knee bowing to him. Well, in fact, their knees did bow to him. They bowed their knee and were coronated in his name. They reigned, in that sense, under his authority. And they've largely been dethroned in favor of democracies in which the people have responsibility for the nations to a much greater degree. And the rulers rule by popular decree. And, it's said that we get the government we deserve because of how we think, how we act, how we behave, and how we vote. The champions, if you will, that we hoist up, in terms of running for these offices and eventually getting elected, they're a product of our culture and of our societies, and we in fact elect them. And so we fall under that same judgment. But again, we're talking about things in aggregate here, and you will reap the rewards or punishments based on the company you keep. Well, it's true, you don't have a choice where you were born, and it's even more difficult to switch citizenship. I'm actually a naturalized United States citizen. I was born in Canada, and I had a Swedish passport, and I had access to um, British citizenship as well through my grandfather. So there are some who do have that ability to, sort of move around. I spent, many years in Europe, 10 years in Germany, living in different countries. But largely speaking, there is an accountability on the citizens, and the way the citizens go, that's the way the nation goes. And as judgment gets passed on these nations, the citizens are under that judgment, if that makes sense. It's just a natural thing that happens when these things occur in aggregate, the twin pillars of civilization being reward and punishment. And within those major guardrails, the plan of God is fulfilled, and the citizens benefit or suffer. They all have a part. We like to think in terms of victims, sometimes even too much, in my opinion, today, rather than autonomy and authority. Oftentimes, it's the abdication of individual citizens that leads to the situation in which they ultimately become victims.
Yeah. I mean,
I
there's
don't know
a
if that
so you
I don't know if that's what you were asking, or if I answered anything
well,
remotely what you were asking.
it no it made me realize. So there's a lot of people say in the United States that there's a lot of people who just don't care about politics and they just go about their business and they feel powerless or they don't care or whatever. And then there's a lot of people who care a lot and they work really hard to change things. and they have their opinions, and they fight, really hard, and they do change things. Like, they have a huge impact. Um, but I, but then there's or you would, and they're the opposition to those. So you'll have like one group of people that are fighting for one thing, and another group of people for fighting for another thing, and they will use as much force as they can in order to get their way, right? So you have this conflict in a lot of countries. I don't know, in the United States you definitely have this sort of conflict, but um, where I see religion coming into play is it sets sort of the rules by which an individual can act in their nation that keep the nation healthy. Whereas if you don't have those rules, and they're more than just they're the rules, they're the spiritual guidance from your faith, right? And if you don't have those, then you're going to do whatever you can to get your way, right? There's no rule that you can't break, because you feel it's so important. So I think that, to
Well,
me,
put another way, the end justifies the means.
the end justifies the means. Absolutely. So when you see, like, someone who to me is religious, regardless of the religion they believe in, they act first out of fear for their God, right? So if their God says you should love your neighbor, and then any action they take in order to better their country first takes into account their need to love their neighbor. So then it takes off the table a lot of that contentious behavior, which actually becomes a problem. So there's that sense of, so that's where I think religion is vital. Otherwise, you are going to just have ideological struggles that and fights to the death. But religion, like you were saying earlier, it inspires us to fight in a way that is cooperative, rather rather than destructive. I think that's one key role of religion.
Well, let's get back to communism, especially as practiced in Russia, but obviously Karl Marx being incredibly influential, right? Uh, in formulating the ideology of communism, also known as socialism, right? His famous phrase, which was interestingly also issued in 1844, was religion is the opiate of the people, right? Well, look what happened when that opiate was removed, right? Look what happened in Soviet Russia. Look what has happened in other communist countries. So, yeah, you could see religion in a sense as being an opiate because it does tend to make people more passive politically, more accepting. The religion of the Bible and other religions teach us to submit to governmental authority, teach us to not, you know, become involved in revolutions, right? Um, but to approach these issues in a different way. And yet they are the guiding light and the inspiration, again, for large masses of people to get them to behave in conformity with spiritual principles, with high moral standards, with aspirational goals that go even beyond the average human's capability, and to do so willingly. The issue of faith teaches us, according to your faith, be it unto you. Jesus said, lift up your eyes and look at the hosts of God that stand there ready to come to your aid, right? And with the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So this inspiration does lead to people taking on superhuman tasks, but not necessarily in a megalomaniac kind of egotistical way. You know, not under the guise of Alexander the Great, for example, or other great political leaders. It's a different kind of inspiration that allows entire nations to move forward, that are you know being built with that faith and that inspiration that often comes from religion. And yes, there are problems. Religion in my view, basically always becomes corrupt, always ends up corrupted. Uh, but nonetheless, we hold this treasure in earthen vessels. There's not much on this earth that doesn't ultimately become corrupted over time. And it's my belief that God sends out His refreshing Spirit and refreshes mankind and gives mankind new inspiration. We've seen that repeatedly, just speaking in the pages of the Bible. From Adam and Noah and Abraham and Moses on down to Jesus, and even then the prophets that came in between Moses and Jesus to guide His people, never leaving them without guidance. And Jesus Himself saying that He would return when, as described in the pages of the prophetic books, including Revelation, things were at their most dark. So, getting back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is my belief that religion is still needed. That, to your point, that charter, that goal, that aspiration isn't enough without something to inspire the peoples to keep moving forward, because we've had no end of setbacks since then. And in recent years, we've had a variety of nations sitting on the Human Rights Council administering this important organ of the United Nations, who themselves would be deemed some of the worst large human rights violators. I mean, certainly there are other nations perhaps than some of those that could be pointed at for being worse, but many of them are small, struggling. I know Syria at one point was on that list, and of course Libya. These are nations that are really, really, struggling beyond belief, and yet some of the larger nations that are also expressing a poor record of human rights are sitting on the council. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm just thinking about like what the individual can do. I mean, you're stuck in these countries. I mean, I guess you're not stuck, but like if somebody's watching this show and they're like, well, what do I do about these nations, and why does it matter? Like, I don't have any power anyways, right?
Well, let me just jump in. The first
Mhm.
thing is, for me, is always to understand what on earth is God doing, right?
Right.
Again, that spiritual inspiration. So I derive my personal
Yeah. Where do
choices.
you get your motivation from? Where does
I derive my personal choices directly from the Word of God. I had such a troubled childhood, as detailed in my book, The People of the Sign, where I was the victim of kidnapping at a young age, smuggled out of the country, separated from both parents and my sisters. And then I like to say, and after that, things got weird, right? Things went downhill from there. I ended up, up in Alaska, living in a tent in 20 below weather to get through high school. I was in a high speed chase with the Alaskan state troopers in pursuit and ended up in jail. And on it went for years. But what pulled me out of that was a direct relationship with God through the pages of the Bible, and a belief that Jesus was real, and he was the living Christ who was actively, on behalf of his Father, governing the course of the world, after he was resurrected. And so tapping into that spiritual power gave me my inspiration, but the decisioning on what to do and what choices to make came from reading the pages of the Bible and going to God and asking Him for answers. What should I do? Believing that when He said, knock and it shall be opened, ask and it shall be answered, seek and you shall find. Believing those things, taking God literally at His word, and studying the pages of the Bible basically every day of my life to get those answers on what I should do personally, my personal individual choices.
can I
But
just say
but but
why
the
I think that's important really fast?
well,
Yeah.
sure. But I want to finish this one thought, and that is that the seeking part of it, however, is to not lose faith and not lose hope. I had to see the proof of what I believed, and that is that God is actively guiding human affairs, and that what the madness that I see out there around me is in fact the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and we are on a divine timeline and his plan is being fulfilled. That helps put my little puny life into context.
I think that's exactly like I believe. I mean, I see there's so many people out there that look at what's happening in the world right now, and they have two options. They can just go along with it and just act like they can pick a side and go along with it and stop thinking about it, which isn't really very fulfilling, right? You say, okay, I want to listen to this channel or this channel. I'll listen to Russian news or U.S. news. I'll listen to whatever you choose a dogma and you go along with it. It's not very fulfilling. You don't feel very like you're a very active person. Like you're very engaged. You're out there doing stuff and you have a lot of energy. But a lot of people who look around in the world and they're wondering what to do, they don't know what to do other than just to agree with the loudest voice in the room, right? And I think that just causes a lot of darkness in people, and they don't have any vision. They don't know what's going on or what their role as a little, however you put it, what their little role is in the world. And I think people need to see themselves in the context so that they can have meaning, so that they can start doing something to give their life meaning. And I think that's like a serious, the plague of America right now for most people, a lot of young people, is just that. Like they're just going along with the TV, which is fine. There's some good things on TV, but a lot of it's just materialism, and it's godless also. Like there's a lot of ungodly things on TV or in the media. It's not a particularly healthy place. So if you don't have something like the Bible or some other book to reference and to make sense of the world, even if it's just, you don't even necessarily have to be right about it. You just have to be struggling to figure it out, right? Like I think that gives people hope and meaning to do the right thing. Just to imagine that they have some agency and they have some reference material, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or whatever book they choose, to try to figure things out for themselves.
Well, and
I
I
think
think many religious people, and what I'm about to say is, I want to emphasize there's absolutely nothing wrong with the situation that I'm about to describe. Nothing wrong with it at all. It's wonderful. But many religious people are merely asking that question, or are saying, look, I don't really care. I just want to know how I should live my life. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? But to
sure.
your point, it can become discouraging over time, right? And you can begin to lose faith because you don't understand the big picture. For me, the big picture was available because I believed it was, because I believed God was willing to show me. Jesus, here's an interesting tangent that will help illustrate this point. Most people believe that Jesus spoke in parables because these stories help make the truth understandable and plain. But when the disciples came and asked Jesus, "Why do you speak in parables?" he said the opposite. Right? He said, "I speak in parables so that they won't understand. I speak in parables so that they will not get the meaning. I speak in parables to hide the meaning from those for whom it is not intended." In other words, Jesus literally said, I'm basically keeping the world in darkness and in confusion. I'm leaving them to themselves. But your ears are blessed. Your eyes are blessed because you see and you hear. It's not that Jesus was closing their minds and hearts, is that they didn't want to know. I'm reminded of Jack Nicholson in that movie, you can't handle the truth, right? Um, but for those who want to know, it is available. You may have to knock repeatedly, you may have to ask repeatedly, but the meaning is clear. And when it comes to the parables, well, guess what? Jesus explained it to his disciples, so every Christian, has the ability to read that and know what it was he said because he gave the answer to it and it was recorded. But that doesn't mean there aren't deeper meanings and that you could read it multiple times and to fully understand it. And guess what? Ever since then, God is continuing to reveal things in parable form. So when we look around the world and we don't understand it, we need to go to God for understanding. And he will grant it if you ask. So it's perfectly fine to say, you know what, I don't need to know that. I'm just going to focus on the principles, the spiritual principles, and I'm going to live my life the way I should. That's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that. But I submit that over time, people become discouraged. And to your point, many people end up in a dark place and they give up faith and they lose faith. Look at what's happened on the planet. People have lost faith. They no longer see the active hand of God. They've become confused, wandering in the paths of delusion, right? Substituting entertainment and materialism or political agendas, politicized goals, and actually becoming tools in the hands of people who use these politicized goals and slogans to capture them and enslave them in a cause with which, frankly, Christians shouldn't really be, or other religious believers should not really be involved in, because they are tools in the hands of somebody who doesn't really have the goodwill of all the people in mind, such as some of those nations that have managed to get on the Human Rights Council exactly because they are perverting the cause of universal human rights in the United Nations. I think this may be a nice segue to go to kind of an oversimplified framework. So I personally have spent much of my life trying to get these answers, and I have been granted them. I don't want to go any further in that direction and now share my vision and my view of exactly what's going on in the world. I mean, I've done that adequately with the Matthew 25 parallel to the Declaration of Human Rights and where we're at in the grand scheme of prophecy. But I want to go back and paint a more basic, simplistic framework that everyone can readily understand based on the first two Psalms of King David, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. I learned several decades ago that these Psalms are prophetic. They're beautiful poems. They're beautiful words that were created as a song. And many churches have turned them into hymns. We had a hymn in our church for Psalm 1 that I can still, it's playing through my head right now. Very basic melody, very simple, but powerful in getting the point across. So Psalm 1 in the New King James has this heading: the way of the righteous and the end of the ungodly. So this is largely speaking um, at a personal level, right? This is not talking about the aggregate. I've posted it in the comments, the first verse, and I will show it here. This is Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. That footnote there refers to, or the wicked, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. The man who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, or stand in the path of sinners, or sit in the seat of the scornful is blessed. And again, to your question, this is how I've tried to live my life, not to seek the counsel of the ungodly, but to look to the Word of God. Live a life that is morally upright, that one that adheres to the traditional standards of morality that have largely been tossed away. Nor sits in the seat of the scornful, of those who mock, who proclaim that God is dead, to invoke Nietzsche, right? A very basic statement that just simply says, look, you're going to be blessed. That framework for civilization of rewards and punishment, you want the rewards, then follow God's path. It is a better way. Any thoughts or comments, Jafar?
I mean, I'm interested if you have more unpacking you could do on the verse, but No,
Well,
as far as
one of the
go ahead.
things to unpack is, okay, what does it mean to be ungodly,
Mhm.
right? What does it mean to be wicked? Well, we've crystallized it out in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? But there are traditional moral values that today have been abandoned. They've been abandoned to such a degree that I almost don't dare mention them here, because if I mention them, I will be labeled as a bigot, right? And there are nations that have now taken it upon themselves to rewrite the Bible to change those traditional moral values, to update them to our modern standard in which those standards of morality no longer exist, right? That's standing in the path of sinners. Um, that's, I guess, about all I'd say in that. And just to say that here, this second verse, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night.
Mm.
He ponders it day and night. And again, something, I'm not trying to build myself up here, but this is how I've lived my life. I have looked to the law of God and to the word of God, and I've meditated, I've pondered on it, I've studied it, and asked these questions that do yield fruit over time, and a willingness to believe the word of God. There's this statement, let God be true and every man a liar.
It just reminds me of the Hobbit. Like Bilbo, Bilbo could have stayed home and not gone on this adventure, but and ate his cakes and had his tea and his two suppers and all that. But he was called, and for some reason he went on the adventure, and he had to give up his home, he had to give up the extra meals, he had to give up all the comforts, but like it was worth it, right? Like it was it was worth it to give up all that stuff. And so I don't know. I think that figuring out, like, the person who chooses to struggle with and to meditate day and night and to figure out whether what's happening in the world is right or wrong is not going to live as comfortable a life, at least mentally. But it's going to be, I think that's sort of the adventure that adds meaning to people's lives, and not comfort but meaning.
Well, there's this saying that any dead fish can float downstream, but it takes a strong live salmon to swim upstream, right? And there is a certain comfort in just floating along, but
Yep.
it doesn't end well. It does not end well, right? It's like there's so many good quotes around this, right? Uh, you know, anyway, none of them come to mind right now. One of them does, but I can't remember quite exactly what it is, around the need to fight for freedom, right? You need to be willing to fight for freedom, or if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, or you'll fall for everything.
It's also work, right? The
Right,
work is an important thing that people, it's a virtuous thing to be doing, and people take it for granted. I watched this. Sometimes I get on Instagram and I watch the reels, and but sometimes you get really good little aphorisms. But it was like Kobe Bryant was talking about his career, and he said, if you get up at 10 o'clock in the morning and you go train at 11 or 12, and then you get home at 2 and you eat dinner, and then or you eat lunch, and then you go train again, and then you eat dinner. You train twice that day. But he's like, what I did is I got up at 4 a.m. I went and trained at 5. I got home at like 10. I ate, and then I went out and trained again afterwards. So he was training like 3 or 4 times a day, whereas everyone else was training twice a day. And he said after 5 years of that, it doesn't matter how hard you train, you're not going to catch up to me. Like,
right,
you're so far behind, because I've been doing
yeah.
that for 5 years, going twice as hard or 3 times as hard as you. And it pays off, and it makes you reap what you sow. So
That ties into the next phrase here. He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. that footnote there, sea or channels, right? A designated path of water, planted by the rivers of water that bring forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. But it takes time for a tree to grow, right? It doesn't say he shall be like a man who wins the lottery. A tree planted by the rivers of water, but with good soil and good water, that tree is destined to grow. And I did not have an auspicious start. I really don't appreciate when people come at me, for example, with the whole white privilege thing, because they have no idea what my childhood was like. And all I can say is, well, I really don't know if living in a tent in Alaska in 20 below weather represents white privilege, right? With no water and no electricity, and having to take a shower in school in order to get a shower, and coming out and putting on my clothes that smelled of tent, basically being called tent boy. But somehow getting through that senior year, and the minute that diploma hit my hand, getting out, well, then, maybe I did have other benefits and privileges and opportunities um, based on my skin color. But my point being that it is hard work, but through consistent hard work, this is true no matter what your circumstances. No matter what your circumstances, if you go to God and have faith, faith can move mountains. Faith can move mountains. And over time, consistently going to God and doing the right thing will yield good results. And in the end, the leaf does not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper by the time it's over. To your point about Kobe Bryant, nobody could catch him in the end. And this is saying that, but it's more universal than just a sport or a material goal. And then this next verse is interesting as we transition into the second part of the verse, which is the contrast between the righteous and the ungodly. But the ungodly are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. And chaff is the outer part of the wheat. And as the wheat was harvested in those times, and you could then collect the wheat in baskets and throw it up in the air and catch it in the wind, and the wind would just blow all that stuff away. That's how they got rid of that, the quick action. It's kind of like reverse gold panning, right? You throw the wheat up in the air and the chaff just gets blown away. Here the ungodly are compared to that. They don't have roots. They're not deriving nutrients from the water. They're not planted in the right place. They are, being blown away because they don't stand for anything. And then it says, further describing the ungodly. Therefore, the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So, getting back to that ultimate judgment, right? The sheep and the goats at the return of the Son of Man who sits on his throne of glory. The ungodly shall not stand in the judgment. So this applies at the individual level, and it also applies on an aggregate. Nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. They're not going to be fellowshipping with the righteous. And the righteous will end up over time in a better situation. And those who are, ungodly will be left out, and they will be ostracized at some point. So obviously, this is not saying there's nothing in this psalm that encourages the righteous to take action against the ungodly. It's simply describing a course, a path, a way of life. As it says in Deuteronomy, there is a way that leads unto life, and there's a way that leads unto death. Choose
Yes.
life that you and your children might live.
Yep.
So then there's a final verse here in Psalm 1. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. Again, going back to Matthew 25, what does Jesus say to the goats at his return? Depart from me, I never knew you. Depart from me, I never knew you. So this is speaking at an individual level, but it also describes how it aggregates up. And the second psalm, which we'll get into here in a minute, talks a lot about how that aggregates up on the ungodly side.
I mean, I
But
think it's great for people. It's like an explanation of nature and what's going to happen if you choose path A and you don't, you know, aim at something and go for it and try, and aim at something good and high. This is what you're going to get. And path B, if you just kind of float downstream and rely on others and kind of just go where the wind blows, like literally this is where you're going to end up. So it's harsh, but it's just the way the world is. It's the way nature is.
well, and getting back to Karl Marx, my biggest complaint and my summary of that whole analysis is that Karl Marx was brilliant. He really did pioneer insight into deep systems thinking and how these things aggregate up and how they work. But ultimately, Karl Marx was taking a materialistic sort of, his basic view was one of envy, right? And encouraging envy, right? Encouraging people to compare what they have with what somebody else has. And I'm just reminded of our efforts to teach our children to just stop the whining about stuff not being fair. And I'm speaking now as a father of an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old, and teaching our children who grow up naturally. I mean, children are naturally, good and positive and grow up curious and wanting to learn, and so many virtues in them. But there's also the tendency, towards some of those negative traits. And one of the ones that we consistently try to work on is stop comparing what you have with what your sister has or with what your brother has. First of all, because you're not equal. One of you is almost 3 years older than the other. And so one of you is going to have more responsibilities. One of you is going to have less responsibilities. One of you is going to have more opportunities, and one of you is going to have less opportunities. One of you is going to have more freedoms, and one of you is going to have less freedoms at every moment in your lives. So stop comparing yourselves, because we're not trying to make it equal. Fair does not mean equal, right? And then there's the outcomes, right? There's the consequences of certain decisions, choices, and behaviors, which further lead to inequality amongst my two children. And teaching them that this isn't something you get to complain about and howl at the moon about. It's something you get to work on and fix, right? And so Karl Marx took the opposite approach. He said it shouldn't be that way, and that, none of this unfairness should exist. And all the unfairness in the world is a result of those who are oppressing those who have not. And guess what? He's not wrong, because human nature does lead greedy, selfish people to oppress each other, right? But whether you're the poor, greedy, selfish one or the rich, greedy, selfish one, we're all people, right? We're all people who don't think that life is fair and who complain about life not being fair. And ultimately, one of the main things for me that was instrumental is realizing that I had no excuse to claim victimhood. And I was a victim by any standard, by any human standard. I was victimized as a child. Not to the degree that some others were. I had it relatively easy compared to some people. But on the whole, compared to, my peers in the Western world, I had it pretty shitty, right? It was pretty bad. And it wasn't fair. And I grew up with a victim mentality. And one of the biggest changes I had to make was to overcome that victim mentality and to realize that it was within my power to change my circumstances. And once I hit adulthood, I had to stop playing the victim card. And that was not easy. My whole mentality was wired around it. So I'm not saying this is just simple or just throw a switch or that I have no sympathy or empathy. It took years, it took decades. It took a serious health crisis and an autoimmune disease for me to really dig in and get to the root causes of what was wrong with me as a result of having been victimized in uncountable ways as a child. And all of us are victimized by society, right? We all live in nations in which human rights aren't practiced. There is no equity, there is no justice that's comprehensive. There are only degrees of justice and injustice on this planet. Again, getting back to the judging of the nations and how this stuff aggregates up. But ultimately, this Psalm 1 paints a very simplistic set of choices, but it is not a caricature. It is not a caricature. It is a simple, clear picture of reality. And you can either trust it or not trust it. If you trust it, then you can count yourself among the godly. And if you don't trust it, you can count yourself among the ungodly, right? What is the, this is the key question here. How do you define who is godly and who is not godly? Those who are godly trust in God, and when he reveals this psalm, they don't argue with it. Right? They don't argue with it. They just accept it and they try to live by it.
Also, those who are godly let God do the sorting and sifting. Like whereas
Right. Who are
whereas
you to judge another man's servant? You have
yeah,
no right whatsoever to determine who else is or isn't ungodly. And that's the thing. Inherent in the verse is the outcome. The outcome itself is the judge. Nobody gets to judge you on this. That's that whole coercive part that we've talked about so often.
yeah, and I think a lot of people are upset with religion, particularly Christianity, because it seems so judgmental, right? But
Well, it is.
it
It sends
relieves,
other
yeah,
people to hell.
but
Christianity is practiced, right?
it relieves us of the burden of judging each other, and it leaves us with, okay, do your best, judge yourself, compare yourself to yourself yesterday, and let your neighbor do their thing, and you can all be different, and let God do the sifting. Because if we start, judging each other and start trying to tweak the system, then that's where we're the only way to do that is through coercion, and then it just turns violent. It turns into every communist system.
We had this discussion briefly with Daniel last time, and I don't recall if it was in the first 2 hours or in the third hour that we continued after we finally ended the show. But what is coercion? Education is not coercion, right? True education. So what I've just been describing here and explaining my take on Psalm 2 is, in my opinion, simply education. I'm
Hmm.
simply outlining this is what the psalm is saying. I'm open to hearing anybody else who tells me that it's saying something different. But this is what the psalm is saying. You can either accept it or not. But according to the psalm, you'll be godly if you accept it, what the psalm says, not my interpretation of it, but what the psalm is actually saying. If you accept it, you're godly. And if you don't accept it, you're not godly. And that's it. But it's not for me to judge you whether you are or are not, or to force you or coerce you. This is a show that people can tune into if they want. And if they don't want, they don't have to. And they don't have to come in here and shower hate upon us for having this perspective, But anyway, so I want to quickly jump into Psalm 2, because this is where we get the aggregation of ungodliness, which is what we, in fact, unfortunately, all too often on this planet experience, right? So, Psalm 2, verse 1 is what I'm now going to show. And by the way, all of these are from the New King James. That's where we're pulling these quotes from, the New King James Version. So this is The second Psalm of David, we're talking about Psalms 1 and Psalms 2, and how they are prophetic and how they form a basic framework and a simple picture that's powerful if we understand it between the godly and the ungodly, and they're prophetic because they aggregate up over time. And the second psalm shows what largely happens as we fast forward through the words of the New Testament and the prophecies being fulfilled, including the book of Revelation. It's a dark picture, and David prophesies this in Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? So here we have an aggregate of ungodliness. Now, the footnotes here, nations could also be translated as Gentiles. In other words, the non-Jews. But it's not just speaking about individuals, it's speaking about the aggregate of those who are considered ungodly. And this is a metaphor. I think nations is a better a better translation of what the intent is here. Um, why do the nations rage or throng tumultuously? Why are they thronging tumultuously? Right? Why do we see the chaos that we saw in World War One and World War Two, and we've seen throughout human history? And the people plot a vain thing or a worthless or empty thing. Verse 2. A little longer. Hopefully, the whole verse can show here. The kings of the earth set themselves, and their rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, and this is a critical concept here. What is it that they're saying? They're saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. Well, what is this really talking about? Well, one interpretation, one way to look at this is that Jesus returns and with a rod of iron subdues the nations, right? That's the prophecy. And yet this was true before he returned, going way back to David's day, right? David is speaking about the situation in his day, right? He's also speaking prophetically. It's always true. And it will continue to be true if we read the book of Revelation, at the return of Jesus, they will even more so, right, be fighting against him and plotting against him at his return. But what jumps out to me is, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. What is this talking about, Jafar? Because we've said that religion in its essence, in its pure essence, is not coercive. So what bonds are they talking about here? What
So
cords
this
are they
is
talking?
the nations are breaking their bonds,
The
or
nations are proclaiming,
right?
they're taking counsel together. They're plotting together. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth shall set themselves, and the rulers shall take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast their cords from us. What cords, what bonds are they seeking to
Right.
break and cast away?
I mean, the only thing that pops into my head is the way that communities have been, I mean, just sort of dislocated from each other and atomized, and we don't have good communities anymore. Um, Anymore. I mean, I don't know that I ever had it, but like, there's not a lot of unity, uh, just like human interaction, at least in the United States.
But
That's
what are they, what bonds,
yeah,
BOND, what bonds are they trying to break? Because you're describing that bonds have been broken, but I don't think that's at all what this is talking about. You're
right.
saying that communities are no longer strong. That's not what this is saying. This is
Yeah,
saying Some nations are raging
Hmm.
against bonds and cords that have been placed around them.
Right. Yeah. So you could say
This isn't saying, it's sad that bonds will dissolve over time. That's not what this is saying at
the
all.
pacts and treaties, or the agreements and the laws and rules that we had in place. Um,
Well, so here's my take on it.
mhm.
We just had Psalm 1 that the righteous are like trees planted by rivers. And in the end, um, that whatever they do shall prosper and their leaf shall not wither. So they become powerful over time. They end up in the long run being the winners. And the ungodly are like the chaff. They end up being the losers, right? Because take God out of it, people who are in alignment with nature, right? And who use the laws of the world wise in a wise and savvy way, they end out on top. You look at a picture of the founders of Microsoft, and they're all these like geeks, right, with long hair and bad clothes, and but they ended up on top because they harnessed the power of knowledge and the before the internet, the knowledge of computing, right? They studied, they went to college and they studied engineering, and they came up with the computer, and it revolutionized the world, and they became the richest people on earth. Bill Gates. They looked like very foolish, weak kids, but they ended up strong. This is just a physical example. But on the whole, Psalm 1 is describing that the godly end up on top and the ungodly don't end up on top, right? So that's one way of looking at this. The other way of looking at this is that they don't like the way the universe is set up, right? They're howling at the moon. There are verses in the Bible where it talks about the pot doesn't get to ask the potter, why did you make me like this? Right? They don't like how God has structured creation. The vain and worthless imaginations that they have is that it can and should be different. I can come up with a better system than the one that God created. I don't like the way in which rewards and punishment are established by natural law or by the creator. I resist and I contend with God Himself. And I want to create an alternate reality that is not aligned with the laws of God. Those are the bonds and the cords that they want to cast off. I don't want to conform with nature. I, in fact, would like to be a different kind of creature than the way I was made. I would like to imagine a society that doesn't live by the traditional morality and laws of God. One that, to take communism for example, is just that's not the best example of what I'm describing,
No,
but it's
it's a good one.
imagining, like John Lennon said, imagine no possessions, and he said imagine no religion. It's easy if you try. Nothing to live or die for. Above us only sky, right? So he cast, and so Sam Harris as well. And if Daniel were here, we could talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Those uh, atheists who have gone on a mission to eradicate religion. Um, they're so some of the intellectuals behind what's being described here.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Um, we
And
could go on
and here,
about that on a lot of different topics in society right now.
right, right. So here's God's response to that. Is He concerned? Oops. Here we go. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. And we'll just quickly go through the next couple of verses here.
I mean, Wade, that
Fascinating.
seems pretty clear to me. I mean, there's that the way you explain it seems pretty crystal clear.
Then
Just
he
want to
shall
say.
speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Now, it's my personal view that God doesn't have to actively do this. He's describing the natural flow of events because he's already said in Psalm 1, the righteous are like a tree planted by the river, and the ungodly are like chaff that blows away. I mean, you think about Hitler, right? I do believe that God blesses, right? But Hitler's end was certain, right? I mean, there was no way ultimately he was going to win. Based on how he behaved and what he did, and in the end, he was fighting the whole world, and then he launched his invasion into Russia, and it was an act of desperation, and it was all over. I do believe that God, was blessing that and working out his purpose. And we know that coming out of that, we had in 1948 the establishment of the state of Israel in fulfillment of just a massive number of biblical prophecies. And also the, you know, establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that emerged out of that chaos.
So,
And
let's finish, and then I have a comment here.
yeah, so yet have I set my king on my holy hill of Zion. Um, Set meaning installed upon Zion, the hill of my holiness. And we read elsewhere that the law will go forth from Zion. And Zion uh, is also a symbolic um, image of the seat of God. And yet, I would not, I would be remiss if I didn't stipulate that it's very clear that as part of all this fulfillment of prophecy, God does return to the Jews to the Holy Land and does establish that as a nation, and Jerusalem itself becomes a stumbling block for the nations. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So there's a whole Christian element to this too. There's a whole spiritual element to this too, in the fact that Jesus, the begotten Son of God, born of a virgin, right, with God as his father, that he played a crucial role in dashing the plans through his sacrifice, in which a um, new power was issued forth into creation, the power of the forgiveness of sin and the establishment of the plan of God. And Jesus conquered many things through his sacrifice, and paved the way for what would eventually come at his return. I don't want to dive into that too deeply because, as I've said before, this is not the purpose of this show is not to teach or preach the Christian religion or any specific religion, but rather to discuss generally the role of religion in society. Ask of me, God says then in this psalm, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. And indeed, as we've pointed out, the knees of the kings did begin to bow to Jesus after that time, as they were coronated in his name. And then, as it says in Matthew 25, upon his return, he then judges those nations. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. So ultimately, God is promising here through these prophecies, through these prophetic psalms, that at the individual level, the righteous will prosper and the ungodly will not. And at the aggregate level, the nations will arise and plot and scheme and seek to overthrow the bonds of decency and the very laws of God themselves. And we see that now with modern science and what mankind is capable of doing. to try to change the natural order of things in a variety of ways. And yet the righteous need not fear because God promises, I will intervene. He laughs at them, holds them in derision, will break them with a rod of iron and dash them like a potter's vessel. We will quickly finish this off and then we can talk about it. So here are the next two verses. Now, therefore, be wise, O kings, be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. This gets back to what you were saying earlier, Jafar, about uh, the role of religion and people, being subservient to their God and fearing their God. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Rejoice within measure. Rejoice in the laws and the teachings of God, not rejoicing in that sort of mad party sense that is so common in today's world. And then finally, this one again concludes here with this verse. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. Now, this is really instructive. I actually gave two 90-minute presentations on Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 some months ago, also on the Clearwater Baha'i channel. For those tuning in from there, you can look these up if you want, where I go into a lot more depth here. But I don't know how much I covered off on this particular point, but let me just say that one of the things I spent a lot of time on was you have to read these in the context of when they were written and who they were written to and understand them in that context. This is actually fascinating when one considers that verses like this are one of the reasons that the Jewish people to whom Jesus came did not recognize him. This is one of the reasons why the Jewish people to whom he came did not recognize him, because they were looking for somebody to come with might and power and a rod of iron and to overthrow the Roman government, right? The Roman government that occupied Judea, to which Jesus came, was an oppressive occupying power that sought to control and limit and even abolish their religion. And they were looking for a savior to come, not to die on the cross for their sins, but to rescue them from these evil overlords and to smash this evil nation. So, absolutely, this is talking about Jesus and what he did when he came the first time, and how through his sacrifice he overcame all powers. And there's this story about him going out to the desert and resisting Satan to qualify and to prepare, and that he learned obedience through his suffering, and his victory on the cross was absolute and complete. And to some of my friends who may be tuning in, I have to acknowledge that it may not even have been a cross. It might have been a stake upon which he was crucified. There are those who are not happy with the symbol of the cross per se. Just acknowledging a wide diversity of opinions on any number of things. But the point that I'm making is, clearly this does not just refer to Jesus at his first coming. Clearly, this also refers to Jesus coming and sitting upon his throne of glory and judging the nations and separating them like sheep and goats, and saying to the goats, "Depart from me, I never knew you." So clearly this prophecy, as is the case with so many prophecies, looks forward to a future that extends thousands of years, and it continues in its fulfillment as the plan of God unfolds throughout human history.
And you connect this last verse to, it refers to nations because of what? Because of the beginning of the Psalms.
Well, the verse that's immediately prior to this.
All right.
Now, therefore, be wise, O kings.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Be instructed, you judges of the earth.
Right.
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 And again, in Matthew 25, I mean, the idea of a democracy, right? This is where I, again, spent time talking about the context. The idea of a democracy was unknown, unheard of, right? The, the people of Israel looked to God to anoint a king. They didn't elect a ruler, but he did choose King Saul, who was one that was well favored by the people because he was a tall, strong military leader kind of guy. And then when David was elected king, well, he was a little shepherd boy, but thankfully he had overcome Goliath, so he was also known as a warrior. But the point is, the idea of a democracy, unknown. So it may seem like a tiny stretch to apply this to modern democracies, but in fact it does. Be wise, O kings, be instructed, ye judges of the earth. And again, who are the judges? The nations themselves have declared that they will be judged by the Declaration of Human Rights. And I've shown that how in Matthew 7, you will be judged by whatever standard of judgment you mete out. So this is how I personally tie these things together in my understanding and in my interpretation of these verses.
Yeah, like we said at the beginning, it takes work to figure this stuff out. Like I don't, on an initial pass of this, I don't get it. But when you like kind of dial it in, like it starts to become clear. So it
Well, and
just
this is just my current understanding, which is
right,
something
right.
that I've arrived at only in the last couple of months after studying this my whole life, is this connection between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how it so neatly fits with Matthew 25. Something I've never seen anyone or heard anyone make that connection. So it's just, maybe you might say, my vain imagination, but that's why I put it out there. Everybody else
But
can look at it. It seems to
but that's
fit so perfectly.
that's kind of the role of religion in a sense, is that it gives you something to aim at and to struggle for and to work at and to discover. Like and then you start to uncover all these gems and hidden treasures in it, and then it unfolds. Instead of imagine all the other things you could have still been doing with your life if you didn't take that path. However many years ago. Instead, you're like still uncovering things in the
Well,
Bible.
and bottom line, I am I'm in awe that the Bible can be seen to have such literal fulfillment. And somebody else will just say, I'm massively proof texting here and making the Bible fit what I see. Well, I've always liked puzzles as a kid, and it's kind of like this piece that I thought was the sky. I find out, it really belongs here in the ocean, right? It was blue, and I thought it went up here, but it actually goes down here, and it really fits here. It seemed to fit up here, but it really fits down here. The fact of the matter is, God exists outside of time and space, and prophecy is history written in advance. The only reason it's hard to understand is A, Jesus spoke in parables to hide the meaning, and B, because the revealed word was given to people who had no clue of what the concepts were that would be present and dominant at the time it was fulfilled, right? Again, the idea of a democracy, for example, you know so how is David going to write a song about how the Human Rights Council of the United Nations in 4000 BC? you know it's it's foolish. Or David didn't live in 4000 BC, but whenever it was 800 BC, it's foolish to even sort of, when you put it in that context, if indeed he was inspired to write a prophecy that would describe what's going on today at the United Nations, what words would this shepherd boy use? you know, in Judea under those conditions and those time periods. So yeah, you might seem like proof texting and fuzzy puzzle fitting, but it is what it is.
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
So the role of religion in society, right? There, there is absolutely a need for our political leaders to invoke God in a sincere and positive way, to point people to God and to encourage them to live up to the standards of their religions.
To have standards, period, and to
Well,
work towards something that,
and yet the sad truth is so many of them are actually aligned with this concept, and they are teaching and educating the people to believe in an idle fancy, right? To believe in a world that is estranged from God. And it's the same old story of the children of Israel dancing around the golden calf, and while Moses is away on the mountain, Aaron is pointing the children of Israel to this golden calf and saying, "Here, Israel, is your God who brought you out of Egypt." And then the people become lost, and then they become enslaved, and then they become dependent because they're no longer, they don't have their roots reaching the water, and they're looking to other human beings to offer them whatever it is that they need. So yeah, the Human Rights Declaration, of and by itself, without religion,
there's nothing to strive
it's
for.
not it's
There's
not going to
Yeah,
end well.
yeah,
But it's not going to deliver the fruit, right? It's
right.
not going to. The righteous are the tree planted by the water who will bear fruit in due season, and the ungodly are just the chaff getting blown away. Whatever fancy you have, it's not going to materialize.
Yeah, the cause of the the Declaration of Human Rights was World War II. It wasn't because people were aspiring towards something or they were being high minded. They're like hell no, we don't want this to happen again.
Right.
That was the cause of it. It's like a fence around the garden maybe or something like that. But it's not a growth. It's not fruit.
And I'm sure there would be those who would say, that declaration is in fact the golden calf, right?
Hmm.
Around which humanity is dancing. I disagree. I believe it is the enshrinement of the principles, but it's kind of like, in that sense, it's kind of like what Jesus said when they demanded a sign of him. And he said, "An evil and an adulterous generation looks for a sign. There shall no sign be given but one." And he only gave one sign. And I'm not going to get into it here. I've covered it in a number of other presentations. But basically, he's saying, "I'll give you a sign, and you're going to choke and gag on it." And so the Declaration of Human Rights, it is humanity's agreement. This is the standard by which we're going to be judged. And that allows Jesus to say, "Okay, fine, I'll judge you by that standard." That standard is, in fact, in alignment with Matthew 25. And when I come back, you're not going to be happy with my judgment because you're not living up to it.
Hmm. Cool.
For many of the nations, I mean, none of the nations are really living up to it. But in this, and I will stand, firm on this. The role of America in the world is substantial, and should not be undermined. I'm not upholding America as pure and righteous, but America is a key actor in the overall plan of God, a key contributor to the forward momentum of justice. This is why we ended up where we were in this conversation. I wasn't necessarily planning to go in this direction of the human rights. Like I said, this is a new understanding, but the Declaration of Independence established these unalienable rights. And the nation was built on those principles. And the nation fought a devastating civil war in 1863, um, which is an important year, even for the Baha'is, which they should be thinking and making this connection, right? In 1863, that war was fought largely over the issue of the abolition of slavery, which, again, for Baha'is, that was the year in which the declaration was made from a religious perspective that abolished slavery. And in that sense, America sprang immediately into action. As it says in some of the writings, the signs of my dominion have appeared in the West. And when that declaration happened, America immediately acted to fight that war and right the wrong that had been in existence since its foundation. America is not perfect, but America is playing a role in achieving these prophetic scenarios here that we've been just talking about in Psalm chapter 2. So I think this may be a good time to end. We've gone on 90 minutes. We can never end in just 1 hour. But next time, we'll maybe go into some of the efforts that various non-governmental entities are undertaking. In particular, I think we mentioned previously Patagonia, and they being a company that has established Earth as their only shareholder and launching a new approach to corporate goals and corporate governance in alignment with the idea of universal principles, universal participation, universal equality, ultimately. Um, and I'm not here to promote Patagonia or any of its products, but rather just to discuss it as an interesting example, as an interesting model. Having said that, like the program, subscribe to it. We'd like you to keep tuning in. We'd like to hear from you with your comments, with your questions. Jafar, not sure if you have any concluding remarks or comments that you'd like to share.
Nope, I'm good. Just enjoyed the chat. So let's do it again.
Awesome. Well, hopefully next week we'll have Daniel back as well from Greece, and he'll be able to share what he's learned there. I've also been talking to a few others that we may have on it as guests in the near future. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in. Please share it. Please invite others, and we'll continue to go down this path of exploring how we are created in the image of God and what the role of religion is in society. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks.